You know that feeling. You're walking through your familiar neighborhood and suddenly, boom, a sleek new coffee shop or maybe a boutique pops up where, like, the old corner store used to be.
Mm-hmm.
It's this weird cocktail of emotions, right? A little bit of excitement for something new maybe, but also that pang of nostalgia for what's gone and sometimes that creeping sense of unease about what might be coming next.
Yeah, that complex mix. It's often tied to one of the most talked about but maybe deeply misunderstood urban phenomena of our time, gentrification.
Exactly. It's a term that sparks, well, a lot of debate, a lot of passion, and frankly, a good deal of controversy.
Oh, definitely. You hear it everywhere, local news, headlines, social media. But what does it really mean, beyond those simple, often pretty loaded headlines?
Right. And that's our mission today on the Deep Dive.
Sure.
We've really dug into a robust stack of sources for you, everything from like foundational academic articles and cutting-edge research to some really raw community discussions to basically pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight on gentrification. Our goal isn't just to define it, though.
No, it's more than that. It's about helping you become truly well-informed on its causes, the surprisingly diverse range of actors involved, its far-reaching and, often paradoxical impact.
Paradoxical is a good word for it.
And the various ways people respond, from policy all the way to protest.
We're going to lean hard into examining the multiple perspectives, the nuances that often just get lost when we try to cram this really complex urban process into a simple black and white story. So, let's unpack this.
Sounds good. Where do we start?
Okay, so to really get a handle on this, let's start at the very beginning. What is gentrification at its core? The term itself, well, it was coined way back in 1964 by the British sociologist Ruth Glass.
Right. She was looking at changes in London.
Exactly. And she described it as the invasion, so word of working class quarters by the middle and upper classes.
Invasion, that's a pretty stark term.
It is, isn't it? And she observed firsthand that this process led directly to the displacement of the original residents and a complete fundamental change in the social character of the district.
Mm-hmm.
It implies a forceful takeover almost.
It really does. And that initial definition, right from the start, it captures the disruptive essence of the process. It highlights that this isn't just, organic growth. It's change that often comes at a real cost to existing communities.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting because while Glass focused on that disruption, some other perspectives frame gentrification almost as a natural, maybe even inevitable cycle of how cities evolve.
A natural cycle. How does that work?
Well, the idea is that historically, the well-to-do always preferred the newest housing. So as a city grows and new rings of housing get built further out, the older housing closer to the center eventually depreciates, it becomes cheap, and then it attracts a new wave of, wealthier residents who invest in it, fix it up, and essentially gentrify it.
And then the cycle just continues pushing outwards again.
Yeah. That's the model, yeah. A sort of perpetual ripple effect from the city center, a constant churn of desirability and reinvestment.
So whether you see it as an invasion or this natural cycle, when we talk about gentrification today, it feels like people interpret it in a few really common, almost gut-level ways.
That's absolutely right. Our sources really highlight three main interpretations, and you've probably heard or maybe even felt all of them yourself.
Yeah, I think so. What's the first one?
The first perspective is often from property owners, especially homeowners. Great, the value of my house is going up.
Right. More money in their pocket, potentially.
Exactly. For those who own property in an area that's gentrifying, the new investment, the new amenities, the rising desirability, it can mean significant financial gains. A clear positive for them.
Okay. Then there's this sort of everyday observation, the one that maybe hits closer to daily life.
You mean like coffee is more expensive now that we have a Starbucks?
Exactly that. It points to the consumer price changes, the lifestyle shifts.
Yeah.
Your beloved local corner store might become a gourmet deli. That cheap diner turns into a trendy bistro.
Right. Avocado toast everywhere.
Pretty much. Or the independent coffee shop gets replaced by a big chain. It reflects this fundamental change in the kinds of services available, tailored to new tastes and, crucially, new wallets.
And then there's the third interpretation. And this one captures the deepest pain of the process, really.
My neighbors and I can no longer afford to live here.
Precisely. This points directly to community displacement, arguably the most significant, most devastating negative consequence. It's when rising costs, property values, taxes, rents shooting up force long-term residents, especially those on lower or fixed incomes, out of their homes.
Out of their communities, severing those deep social ties.
Yeah, it's brutal.
That last point really hits home, doesn't it? It makes you wonder, what exactly drives these changes? Why do some neighborhoods go through this dramatic transformation while others don't seem to change much at all?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is it just a few wealthy people moving in, or is it something much bigger, more systemic?
Yeah.
Well, back in 1984, sociologists Palin and London, they compiled 5 key explanations that had emerged, trying to paint a clearer picture of the forces at play. This was based on thinking from the 70s mostly.
Okay, 5 explanations. What's the first?
The first they identified was demographic ecological. This points to big shifts in household structures, specifically the rise of dual white-collar wage earner households, often with fewer kids.
Ah, the dinks, dual income, no kids, or maybe just fewer kids.
Sort of, yeah. These households, often with higher disposable incomes and less need for big suburban houses, increasingly wanted to live closer to work, especially in inner cities, which were becoming more appealing again.
Right, optimizing for less commute time, maybe a different lifestyle. That makes sense, especially as city centers change too. What was number 2?
Second is sociocultural. This suggests a pretty profound shift in preferences among the middle and upper middle classes, a growing embrace of pro-urban views, actively choosing city living over the traditional suburban ideal.
So it became cool to live downtown again. The allure of city life culture, convenience, vibrancy, maybe rejecting suburban conformity.
Exactly. It ties into a broader cultural shift, maybe even a romanticization of the city in some ways.
Okay, and the third explanation?
That would be political economical. This one highlights the decreasing availability of undeveloped suburban land, as building out became harder and more expensive.
Right, running out of space.
High-income individuals and, importantly, developers started looking back towards urban areas for housing and investment. They saw potential in previously overlooked central neighborhoods.
So less space to build out forced development in.
Yeah.
A powerful economic driver. What about technology's role? Did that push people apart or pull them together?
That brings us to their fourth point. Community networks. It's a bit counterintuitive, maybe. But advances in transportation and communication tech actually played a role.
How so?
Well, instead of just dispersing people, these advances, especially better urban transit, actually prompted more people to desire living in large-scale, interconnected communities, the kind cities naturally offer. They could feel connected, but still have a neighborhood identity.
Huh. So technology, instead of isolating us, sometimes drew people closer together in dense urban spots, making city life more manageable and appealing for a new wave. Fascinating. And the fifth one?
The fifth is tied to social movements. This is where high-status elites and influential institutions actively sought to revive inner cities.
Actively, like deliberate efforts.
Yeah, through targeted cultural projects, urban renewal initiatives, or just championing a return to urban living. Their deliberate efforts and investments attracted more high-income folks, essentially kickstarting or speeding up gentrification beyond just organic shifts. It wasn't passive.
Got it. So, a powerful mix. Individual choices, land availability, tech, and these deliberate revitalization efforts. But our sources also point to other big drivers beyond these 5, right? So it's even more complex.
Oh, absolutely. One big one is just fatigue with car-dependent urban sprawl. People got tired of long commutes, traffic, the expensive cars.
The whole car-centric lifestyle.
Exactly. So they started seeking out urban areas, especially places with good public transit, walkable amenities, a more sustainable way of life.
And jobs were pulling people back, too.
Yeah. A scholar named Lee observed this increased demand for urban living was directly linked to a rise in professional jobs in central business districts. If your job's downtown, living downtown makes a lot of sense.
Minimizes the commute, immerses you in that career-centric vibe. But it's not just individuals making choices, is it? What about the big money?
That's where critical geographers come in. They re-emphasize the instrumental role of capital flows and big real estate developers.
They see it less as organic and more as, what? A deliberate investment strategy.
Pretty much. Driven by the profit motive. Developers are acutely aware of where they can maximize returns by turning undervalued properties into high-yield assets. Money talks, right?
So gentrification isn't just happening to a neighborhood, it's actively done to it by powerful economic actors. That's a crucial distinction.
It is. And you also have the huge trend of deindustrialization in developed nations, the loss of those stable, often unionized blue-collar manufacturing jobs.
Right, the economic base disappearing for many.
That potentially displaced a lot of working and middle-class folks even before the new, wealthier residents started moving in. Their ability to afford rising costs was just eroded.
Wow. Okay, so it was this incredibly complex, interconnected web of forces. Individual desires, massive economic shifts, technological change, deliberate investment, all tangled together.
Absolutely.
So now that we have a clearer sense of what gentrification is and what drives it, let's talk about the who. Who are these gentrifiers? We often have this narrow stereotype, right? Like young, rich, single professionals, maybe childless couples.
Yeah, that's the common image. But the research we looked at shows it's actually far more diverse and nuanced. While that stereotype might hold some truth, various groups contribute to and are shaped by this process, sometimes in surprising ways.
Okay, so beyond the stereotype, who are we talking about? Let's start with the upper class.
Right. Their social mobility and financial freedom are obviously major factors. Wealthier families can choose urban living, often pulled by that increasing demand for college-educated workers in central business districts we mentioned.
And that demand for their skills actually drives up salaries.
Which then directly drives up housing prices in those desirable urban areas. Their very presence and purchasing power act as a catalyst.
And our sources mentioned research by Wang and Lin supporting this, that the influx is partly due to this demand for college-educated workers.
And it's not just about them moving in. Research also shows that when these college-educated workers settle down and start raising families in urban areas, it creates ripples. It impacts local education costs, influences who moves where between the city and suburbs. They become embedded.
They change the long-term fabric.
Yeah.
But it's not just the super wealthy, right? You mentioned women playing a significant role.
Yes, particularly highly educated women. One researcher, Smith, suggested that as more women got higher education and better paying jobs, their participation in the labor force expanded, creating this reservoir of potential gentrifiers, as he put it.
A reservoir. Interesting. And the inner city appeals to them. Why?
Often, it's concentrated access to well-paying jobs, crucial networking opportunities, and maybe a more efficient lifestyle that fits with demanding professional careers.
Efficiency. That ties into another group you mentioned.
Yeah.
Single parents, especially mothers.
Exactly. There's this idea of marginal gentrification. For single parents, particularly mothers, the inner city's density can be incredibly helpful.
How so?
Think about proximity to professional childcare, public transit, multiple services all close together. It can minimize the time constraints of juggling multiple jobs, childcare, getting groceries. It becomes a very practical, functional choice.
That's a perspective. You don't often hear gentrification driven by the practical needs of single mothers managing complex schedules. Okay, who else? Artists. They seem like the classic first-wave gentrifiers.
Yes, almost the archetype. Philip Clay's model puts artists as stage one, or marginal gentrifiers. There was even a National Endowment for the Arts study linking the proportion of artists in an area to the rate of inner-city gentrification.
So they have a tangible impact. What makes them willing to move into these often deteriorated areas first?
Well, they're often willing to take the risk. They see potential in rundown properties. They might have the creative vision, the time, the skills, maybe just the ability to do renovations on a tight budget.
They see beauty in decay, kind of urban pioneers. David Lay talked about their critique of everyday life, their search for meaning.
Right. But it's also about identity and lifestyle choice. For many artists, living downtown offers this cultural emancipation from what they see as maybe boring suburban conformity.
And practically, it makes sense, too.
Oh, yeah. Direct access to customers, proximity to the art scene, that unique energy and intensity of inner city life. They're drawn to the grit, the authenticity, before it gets polished.
Ironically, paving the way for that very polishing. Okay, another group with a unique role. The LGBTQ plus community.
Absolutely. Manuel Castells did pioneering research on this, especially looking at gay communities like in San Francisco's Castro district, identifying them as early gentrifiers.
And sometimes this was even enabled by policy.
In some cases, yes. Like in Buenos Aires, certain areas became predominantly LGBTQ plus only when the government allowed them to be revitalized and gentrified, creating spaces of relative safety and acceptance.
So it's complex. Certain areas become seen as safe, progressive, attracting LGBTQ plus residents and businesses, but that very safety for one group can then put previous, often lower-income communities at risk of displacement.
It's a profound paradox, and one of the toughest aspects. Today, almost all of those historic neighborhoods are actually less LGBTQ plus centric precisely because of modern, widespread gentrification.
And that can perpetuate other issues.
Disturbingly, yes. Classism, racism. Especially when affluent white gay men settle in these areas, driving up rents and pushing out long-term residents, often people of color.
Like in that documentary Flag Wars.
Exactly, which showed the tensions in Columbus, Ohio. We see it in D.C. too. Rising costs, sometimes even government use of eminent domain for redevelopment, have displaced many LGBTQ plus people and forced iconic businesses to close. It erases history.
A truly bittersweet reality. Spaces of security becoming zones of displacement. This leads us right into the broader consequences of gentrification impacting everything from local shops to schools to people's finances.
Yeah, the ripple effects are huge. One of the first things you often see is that dramatic shift in the local economy and culture, what gets called retail gentrification.
Meaning?
As new, higher-income residents move in, local businesses change. They have to cater to different tastes and, crucially, higher spending power, so you get this rapid expansion of trendy restaurants, boutiques, new entertainment spots.
Pushing out the older, more affordable places. Your favorite cheap liner becomes a fancy brunch spot.
Right. And the irony, as our sources note, is that the marginal gentrifiers, like those artists we talked about, often get priced out by the very process they help start.
Yeah, they make it cool, then they can't afford the cool anymore.
It's a classic example of what Sharon Zukin called the commodification of urban authenticity.
Meaning the very things that attract people initially, the diversity, the historic buildings, the quirky local shops, the artistic vibe, they disappear, get diluted as the area gentrifies.
Exactly. Zukin critiqued Jane Jacobs for perhaps not fully recognizing how market forces would eventually commodify those authentic urban experiences she championed. Unique character becomes a product and loses its essence.
The thing you come for gets destroyed by your arrival. Deeply unsettling.
Okay, beyond businesses, what about the impact on schools and public services?
Also significant and often overlooked, policies aimed at attracting gentrifying families to historically underfunded schools can backfire.
Well, you can get this unbalanced landscape of influence. The voices of more affluent, often better resourced, new parents can end up drowning out the voices of lower-income families who've been there for generations.
So political and cultural displacement within the school system itself. And there's a financial hit too, right? Title I funding.
Huge. As higher income families move in, the school's overall income profile changes, and it can lose its Title I eligibility. That federal funding is crucial for supporting low-income students, extra staff, programs, tech. Losing it is devastating.
And school choice policies can play a role too?
Research suggests they do. The expansion of charter and magnet schools seems to significantly increase the likelihood that college-educated white households gentrify low-income communities of color. So seemingly neutral policies can accelerate the process.
Wow, this all paints a pretty grim picture for original residents.
Yeah.
But is there any upside for those who manage to stay? Our sources had that fascinating study from Philadelphia on financial health.
Yes, that was a really unique study using a massive consumer credit database Equifax scores in Philly from 2002 to 2014. It looked directly at the link between gentrification and residents' credit scores.
Okay, and what did it find for the people who stayed in gentrifying neighborhoods? This feels important.
Surprisingly, it found that, on average, gentrification is positively associated with credit score improvements for residents who stay.
Positively? Really?
Yeah, an average increase of about 11.3 points over 3 years, and that nearly doubled to 22.6 points for stayers in neighborhoods undergoing intense gentrification.
Okay, that's significant. Does it apply to everyone who stays or just the ones who are already doing okay?
That's the really interesting part. Even less advantaged residents, those with low starting scores, older residents, long-term residents, people without mortgages who manage to stay, also see positive increases. Maybe smaller increases than their more advantaged neighbors, but still positive. It definitely challenges that simple narrative that gentrification is only bad for everyone already there.
So even if you're struggling, there might be a measurable financial benefit if you can hold on. But we need to remember what credit scores actually reflect, right? It's not just cash in the bank.
Exactly. It's primarily about debt levels and payment behavior. Things like payment history, how much debt you have, credit history length, new accounts, types of credit used.
So how would gentrification improve that?
Well, maybe the improved economic environment offers more stable job opportunities for some, or access to services that help manage finances. It could indirectly support more stable payment behavior, which boosts the score.
Got it. But are these increases really meaningful? Like 11 points, is that enough to actually make a difference?
It absolutely can be. Even small increases can significantly improve credit availability or lower borrowing costs. Think about applying for a mortgage, a credit card, an apartment, even some jobs. A better score boosts your chances, especially if you're near a cutoff point.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. Take a standard Fannie Mae mortgage. Someone with a score between 600 and 699 might get an interest rate 1.25% lower than someone between 666, 679. Over 30 years, that's tens of thousands of dollars saved.
Wow.
And if your score is below 620, getting that loan at all is tough. So these small increases can literally save huge amounts of money or open doors that were completely shut.
That's a powerful argument for trying to stay, if possible.
Yeah.
But what about the people who can't stay, the ones who are displaced? What did the Philly study find for them?
And here, the picture gets much darker for the less advantaged. Moving from gentrifying neighborhoods was negatively associated with their credit score changes.
Negatively?
Yes, especially for those who moved to lower-income neighborhoods or other neighborhoods within the city. Their scores tended to drop relative to those who stayed. The average change for movers was about 3 points lower than for stayers.
So displacement has a measurable negative financial impact. It can contribute to a downward spiral.
It seems to, yeah. Now, we have to acknowledge the study's limitations. It can't prove direct causation because of selection issues. Maybe people expecting score improvements move to gentrifying areas, or those with declining scores are forced out.
Sure, correlation isn't causation.
Right. And disentangling the timing is tricky. But the correlation is strong and suggests displacement carries a real financial penalty for vulnerable residents.
And this brings us right back to Ruth Glass's original point about displacement, the human cost. Beyond Philly, we see this in LA County, too.
Definitely. In LA, researchers found single people, folks in crowded households, and Hispanic and African American residents were more likely to end up moving into neighborhoods with lower quality schools after being displaced.
So the negative effects are concentrated among the most vulnerable.
Largely, yes. Though interestingly, single parents, when displaced, often prioritize schools and might move further out to find better ones for their kids. But overall, the data shows displacement disproportionately harms marginalized communities.
A powerful illustration of how the burden of change falls unevenly. So is this happening everywhere? Is gentrification just an American thing, or is it global?
Oh, it's definitely global, though it takes different forms. Take London. Geographer Loretta Lees coined the term super gentrification there.
Super gentrification. Sounds intense.
It is. She argues it's driven not just by the middle class, but by super wealthy professionals, especially in finance. It operates on a higher economic order, requiring massive salaries and bonuses just to afford places like Barnsbury in inner London.
Barnsbury?
Yeah.
What's the story there?
It was middle class originally, then became cheap and run down after WWII. Early pioneers moved in, doing self-financed renovations. But a key moment was the 1959 Housing Act, investing $100 million in rehabs across the city.
Government investment kicking things off.
It seems so. That sparked a population influx in the 60s and 70s, increased owner occupation, setting the stage. Then in the 80s, converting those old houses into luxury flats for the super rich really took off.
And the impact?
Severe. Rising prices across London linked to this have led to a doubling of private landlord evictions and a long-term decline in home ownership since the early 2000s. It's become incredibly unaffordable.
A stark picture. What about somewhere completely different, like Mexico City? A massive, rapidly growing metropolis.
Mexico City is facing huge challenges. It's enormous, 21 million people, adding 1,100 daily. Development has largely catered to elites, funded by state and private money, partly because that group generates so much national income.
So government policy is kind of reinforcing the inequality by focusing on the wealthy.
It appears that way, and the consequences are dire. Not just density, traffic, and pollution from often chaotic planning, but also pushing huge numbers of low-income families to the city's edges.
Into informal settlements.
Yes, threatening the safety and livelihoods of the 11.5 million people relying on the informal economy. It adds to an existing crisis where 40% already live in settlements lacking basic services like sewage or clean water.
And the city's geography makes it worse.
The valley traps pollution, creating chronic health issues.
Right.
Tragically, authorities often overlook these effects, calling them inevitable or even denying they exist.
That's disheartening. Okay, back across the Atlantic. France. Paris.
In Paris, historically poor eastern neighborhoods have seen prices soar and wealthy residents move in. There's social housing aiming for a social mix, but often it ends up serving the lower middle class, not the poorest.
So the poorest still get pushed out. Where do they end up?
Initially, the close suburbs, 1970-2000, but since 2000, increasingly to remote peri-urban areas with terrible public transport.
Making daily life incredibly hard.
Exactly. These displaced people are sometimes called les invisibles, the invisibles. They fled rising costs for the countryside, but face huge commuting costs, up to 4 hours daily.
That must breed resentment.
It does. Many feel investments are going to new immigrants in the close suburbs, which are now gentrifying themselves while the displaced native French are ignored. It creates complex social tensions.
Wow. What about South Africa, with its unique history?
Well, research often overlooks smaller towns there. But some studies, like in Aberdeen, East Cape, show redevelopment reflecting middle-class values, sometimes framed positively due to state programs improving housing.
So sometimes it's presented as beneficial.
In certain state-led contexts, perhaps. But then you have Woodstock, Cape Town, a stark contrast, intense displacement there.
How intense?
Upper Woodstock became mainly white and affluent. Lower Woodstock attracted mixed middle incomes. But the housing market surged 400, 500%, brutally displacing working class and retired renters.
And the landlords used harsh tactics.
Absolutely horrific tactics, according to the sources, using obscure clauses for eviction, massive rent hikes, even cutting off power and water to force people out, like on Gympie Street.
Good grief.
Researchers observing this concluded that the elite were essentially colonizing urban areas from the less privileged. A really disturbing take.
A chilling illustration of Glass's invasion.
Yep.
Okay, let's jump to Italy and Poland. Different histories again.
In Italy, Milan is seeing big changes in former working-class industrial areas. Isola is a prime example. Once isolated, it attracted artists and stylists in the 2000s.
An organic start.
Followed by a massive, deliberate rebranding project, Progetto Porta Nuova, with landmarks like the Bosco Vertical Towers, completely transforming the area. Other districts like Lambert Ventura, Bicocca, Bovisa, Nolo are also gentrifying, sometimes linked to universities.
And Poland, driven by deindustrialization.
Largely, yes, and poor housing conditions. Yudu is maybe the biggest example in Europe right now. It faced huge unemployment, 24% in the 90s, after its garment industry collapsed.
So they launched a massive redevelopment.
Huge. Transforming the industrial district into a new city center, repurposing old buildings like the power station into a railway station and science museum, trying to attract new business and residents.
A complete overhaul. Is the government backing this?
Yes, the Polish government's National Revitalization Plan supports these municipal programs across the country. Krakow's Kazimierz district, driven by tourism investment. Poznan universities. Wrocław, Wałbrzych, adapting factories for culture. Warsaw's Praga-Poznań. It's widespread.
So sometimes it's very deliberate government-led transformation. Okay, let's bring this right down to the ground level. We looked at some community discussions from Reddit about Pittsburgh, a city that knows post-industrial change. What jumped out?
The immediate thing is that deep tension between revitalization and gentrification. People use them differently, with revitalization sounding positive, helping the community, and gentrification negative, taking over, displacing people.
But many argue they're linked, maybe phases of the same thing. It's a fine line.
It really is. The Pittsburgh discussions show this perfectly. One user describes Carnegie as a success story, feeling less like colonization and more like improvement.
What makes them say that?
New galleries, coffee shops, restaurants popped up alongside older, cheaper ones. Crucially, original residents, like their friend working locally, could still afford rent nearby. It retained its old feel, kept things at the library.
So balance, not erasure. Any other examples of revitalization done right?
The Penn Ave Arts District was mentioned. They apparently fought to keep big corporations out, except for a needed Aldi grocery store affordable food access was key.
Prioritizing community needs. Smart.
Yeah, and they filled it with small businesses, community art programs, strong support systems like grants, PPP loans, virtual events during COVID. They even converted a blighted warehouse into affordable apartments, half for veterans, with community arts businesses downstairs. Plus food distribution, computer drives, GoFundMe campaigns. Really intentional stuff.
Concrete efforts to mitigate harm and support locals, but then there's the flip side, the worst gentrification example.
That was East Liberty, according to many, described as unrecognizable, massive loss of culture. The Whole Foods replacing the Penn Plaza apartments was a huge flashpoint, despite protests.
And the new housing.
Bakery Square dismissed as glorified dorms, with rents up to $3,000. seen as totally unaffordable, driving displacement. The feeling was just money talks, making it hard for revitalization not to become gentrification when big money moves in.
That line seems so easily crossed. What about other neighborhoods mentioned?
Allentown got praise for keeping its neighborhood feel. Garfield was interesting, acknowledged as much safer now. It used to be really rough, but also lamented for losing character, beloved places torn down for developments catering to, quote, rich white people.
So even improvements come with resentment about who benefits.
Exactly. A local nonprofit is trying to manage it, but with abandoned houses and developer interest, residents feel it's only a matter of time. Similar fears for Northside, with studio rents hitting $2,500 in converted warehouses, worrying it'll become like the already gentrified Strip District. Coriopolis, Brighton Heights, also mentioned.
This sparks that big debate, right? Some argue new, expensive construction is necessary to boost overall supply and eventually lower prices elsewhere, even if it displaces people initially.
Yeah, that's the argument. That we haven't built enough housing for decades, and new builds are always pricey at first. If we'd built luxury consistently, supply would meet demand, prices would stabilize. They argue dense, expensive urban cores are better, overall less commuting, more sustainable, better tax base.
But the critics push back hard. They want affordable housing serving the existing community, not more Bakery Square BS.
Right. And then there's the NBY issue, people using historic preservation, not genuinely, but to block denser middle-class apartments, leading instead to single-family homes only the rich can afford.
Highlighting that tension between preservation, density, affordability, and whose interests win out. And underlying all this in Pittsburgh, the racial aspect seems really raw.
Very much so. A strong sense that economic displacement is often driven by race, citing historical injustices like redlining, discriminatory loan practices, houses being undervalued just because the owners are black. It creates this cycle of disinvestment, then exploitative reinvestment.
Which brings it all back to that fundamental question the community is asking itself. Is revitalization truly possible without gentrification in poor neighborhoods? Clearly, no easy answer. One person's revitalization is another's displacement.
Exactly.
Okay, so given all these complexities, the intense debates, the real human impacts, how are cities and communities actually responding? And how do researchers even measure something so multifaceted and charged? Let's look at policy, direct action, and then the science of tracking change.
Starting with governments, some places, like German municipalities, have historically had a strong legal hand in zoning and real estate integrating social goals. Munich's had a milieu conservation law in its Lehel district since the 60s.
Since the 60s, what does it do?
It lets the city veto certain demolitions or conversions, even buy properties, specifically to preserve the social mix and keep housing affordable.
A proactive structural approach?
Yeah.
Any others?
Bologna, Italy, implemented a socially aware renovation and zoning system back in '74, recognized by the Council of Europe for preserving the historic center while protecting residents. But there's tension.
How so?
Most economists, our sources say, don't believe government anti-gentrification measures actually make cities better off economically. So you have this conflict between social equity goals and perceived economic health.
That tension again. Okay, beyond government policy, what other responses do we see? More direct stuff.
Yeah, direct action, sometimes confrontational. Class conflict can manifest as vandalism, even arson, targeting gentrifiers' property.
Like that Mission Yuppie eradication project in San Francisco during the dot-com boom, protesting rising rents by destroying property.
Exactly, desperate measures. And not just in the U.S. In Wales, Mybe and Glyndŵr set fire to English-owned holiday homes for years, responding to a housing crisis and perceived loss of Welsh culture.
Wow, so it can tie deeply into cultural identity.
Yeah.
Berlin had protests too.
Yeah, the Schwabenhaus protests against the influx of perceived affluent Swabians seen as driving gentrification in '89 and 2013.
And the serial killer cafe protest in London, that became a symbol.
It did. In 2015, this cafe selling expensive cereal got attacked by anti-gentrification protesters, reportedly middle-class academics, frustrated by unaffordable luxury flats. It sparked debate about targeting small businesses versus the bigger system.
Similar to the San Francisco tech bus protests in 2013. Those private buses became symbols of rising rents, displacement.
Huge symbols, yeah. They inspired movements elsewhere. And sometimes it doesn't take physical action, just perceived insensitivity, like that Inc. coffee sign in Denver.
Oh yeah, the happily gentrifying sign. That blew up fast.
Instantly. Outrage, vandalism, protests. They had to close for a bit. Shows how incredibly sensitive the issue is, how quickly backlash can happen.
Okay, so beyond confrontation, What constructive tools do communities use?
Community land trusts, CLTs, are a key one. They're legal structures that take land off the open market permanently.
How does that help?
The trust owns the land, leases it cheaply, residents own or lease the buildings on it. It freezes property values, removes land from speculation, prevents economic eviction, often used with inclusionary zoning policies.
Which require affordable units in new developments. What about rent control? That seems like a direct fix.
It restricts rent increases to protect current tenants, aims to curb speculation, reduce empty units held for profit, but it's highly debated.
Why? What are the downsides?
Critics say it limits overall housing supply as developers have less incentive to build. It can lead to black markets, key money, or vacancy decontrol, where rents jump once a tenant leaves, leading to loss of rent-controlled stock and sometimes landlord harassment to force tenants out.
So mixed results.
Yeah. Places like Santa Monica gentrified despite rent control. Massachusetts abolished it in '94. Rents rose, but other factors were involved too. No silver bullet.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Which highlights how hard it is to address gentrification, partly because it's so hard to even measure accurately.
Exactly. The science of tracking it is tough. Researchers face diagnostic instability.
Meaning small changes in how you measure it lead to big differences in what gets identified as gentrifying.
Precisely. 2 studies, same city, different criteria, different results. Frustrating for planners who need reliable data to tailor policies or learn from research.
So how are researchers trying to improve measurement?
There are efforts. An MIT study used the smallest geographies, census tracts, ZIP codes, and a wide range of data. Housing price indexes, FHFA, Zillow, IRS income data, Census ACS demographics.
And how did they define gentrifying?
They calculated percentile ranks within a whole metro area, MSA. Gentrifiable areas were in the bottom income quartile. Gentrifying areas showed a 25 percentile gap opening up between rising house values and incomes, usually in the inner third of the MSA. They also looked at expectations-based variables, signs of future investment.
A dynamic definition capturing the process. What are the pros and cons?
Trade-offs. Bigger areas, mask variation, small thresholds might miss places. But aggregation smooths noise. Benefits. It gives a timely, understandable, available measure. Practitioners can track it locally, researchers can study outcomes, see how neighborhoods move through socioeconomic hierarchies.
Super valuable for understanding the dynamics. Beyond specific techniques, what conceptual models help frame this?
Spatial analysis offers a few. The classic invasion and succession model from early urban sociology. One social group invades and supplants another, often upper class displacing working class, leading to social homogeneity.
One group in, one group out. What else?
The life cycle model. Neighborhoods evolve, housing ages, leading to decline and potential redevelopment. Then the gentrification back to the city model. A widespread return to urban living ideals, cosmopolitan, transit-friendly, classic architecture.
People drawn back to the older urban core. Do these models work together?
The thinking is yes, they coexist and interact. Factors like changing racial preferences, aging housing stock, demand for central locations, all combine to reshape neighborhood attractiveness.
And change often spreads outwards, right? Not just isolated pockets.
Exactly. That's spatial spillover. Starts from a seed area and expands based on connectivity, adjacency, a ripple effect.
So given these concepts and challenges, what modeling strategies do researchers use?
Various ones. Linear modeling is common, isolates relationships between specific variables, useful for policy ideas, but can be reductive.
Good for simple cause effect.
Yeah.
What about transition and sequencing models?
They assume history predicts the future, looking at transitions to forecast trajectories, think geodemographic typologies, labeling areas as young professional, etc., useful for forecasting but can miss big external shocks.
And simulation models?
Powerful for testing complex interactions, transport changes, policy impacts, demographics, but they need tons of data, can be hard to interpret, and results can be unpredictable if assumptions are off.
So bottom line on measurement.
It's incredibly hard work. Any model simplifies a deeply complex social, economic, political, geographic process. There's no single, universally agreed upon operational definition of gentrification. It remains a dynamic, moving target.
Wow. Well, we have certainly unpacked a lot today. This deep dive really shows gentrification is far from simple good or bad.
No, it's deeply multifaceted, driven by demographics, economics, policy, culture, all interacting.
We've seen the diverse actors involved, from the super wealthy to artists, LGBTQ+ communities, often with unintended consequences.
And those profound impacts. Changing shops and schools, the nuanced financial effects, positive credit scores for some stayers, but negative outcomes and displacement for vulnerable movers.
The global examples show its reach, from London's supergentrification to Mexico City's crisis, South Africa's colonization dynamic, Poland's state-led renewal.
And those Pittsburgh community voices brought it right home. The raw debates, the pain, the search for genuine revitalization.
Plus the responses policy, CLTs, rent control debates, direct action protests.
And finally, grappling with how incredibly hard it is just to measure and define this constantly shifting urban reality.
It's so clear that understanding gentrification means looking way beyond headlines.
Yeah.
You have to embrace the data, the human stories, the conflicting perspectives shaping our cities.
Absolutely.
So what does this all mean for you, listening right now, as you see the changes in your own community? If truly authentic urbanism requires both economic viability and cultural rights to the city, the right for existing communities to stay and shape their future, how can we build communities that evolve without erasing the very people and spirit that made them vibrant in the first place?
That's the question, isn't it? Something to really ponder.